Thank you, Suji, and thank you everyone for the great questions ahead of time. So a lot of you are asking some specific questions about, for example, how we handle Quebec and differences between NCAA and NAIA. And these are all things that we will talk about in the presentation today, or have a resource for you of where to find some of those specific questions. Like we have a PDF that covers all of Quebec. So we'll get into that here momentarily. But as Suji said, I'm Elizabeth Thompson. I'm our Associate Director of International Outreach and Education. As Greg asked earlier, yes, I'm a part of the official NCAA. So we're the National Collegiate Athletic Association that most famously puts on the basketball tournament every year. That's kind of our biggest dance, as we say, that gets the most spotlight, but we host over 90 championships amongst our 3 divisions. So what I do is I work to educate all of the students outside of the United States on the opportunity to get a sports scholarship in at an NCAA Division 1 or 2 school. So things that we're going to cover today are what are the options for sports scholarships. So as Gustavo asked, the difference between NCAA and NAIA, that's another option that we'll talk about. How to become eligible for the NCAA, both academically and as an amateur in your sport. And then I'm going to touch on some resources, and we'll kind of close up with some recruiting best practices, recruiting calendars, and how you can, or how a student can self-promote themselves to coaches without having to use a recruiting service. So there are lots of options to obtain a sports scholarship or to play a sport at a college within the United States. So the NCAA is just one of those options. 2 other most commonly heard of organizations for intercollegiate athletics within college sports is the NAIA. So that's just another organization of schools. They're just not NCAA schools. And then there's the NJCAA, which is the National Junior College Athletic Association. And those are typically 2-year schools or colleges. And so there's just 3 different options. And then amongst the NCAA, we have 3 different divisions, Division 1, 2, and 3. And I'll talk about what makes up the differences in a school being a Division 1, 2, or 3 school here shortly. But then in addition to that, every school outside of their athletic department and sports scholarship process for NCAA sponsored sports also offers club teams, and those are sports that a school may sponsor, but the donations typically come from private donors or alumni, something outside of the athletic department, or maybe with an academic scholarship and not an amateur scholarship. They have their own championships each year. It's just not NCAA sponsored. So that just means there are typically less teams. They have a different governing body that oversees those particular sports. And then there are also intramural sports, and those are kind of open to anyone on campus. Maybe you played briefly in middle school or the beginning of high school and never pursued the sport further, but wanted to get together with maybe 5 or 6 friends on campus and play in a softball league on Saturdays or something. So those are lots of different levels of sports offered at the universities, but obviously the scholarship sports are those NCAA sponsored sports at the Division 1 and 2 level. So now I'll talk about what exactly we are as the NCAA, so you have a little more information. So we're made up over 1,100 colleges and universities, totaling almost 500,000 student athletes that are participating at a school annually. Almost 20,000 teams, and we host 90 championship sports amongst Division 1, 2, and 3, men's and women's, that is made up of 24 different sports amongst those 3 divisions. So understanding the difference in the 3 divisions and what makes a school a Division 1 school versus Division 2 and 3, some of those differences include the number of men's and women's sports that are offered at a university, the size of the student body. So Division I schools are your larger universities that tend to have, 10, 20, 30, even 40,000 students attending that school. The size of the athletics budget, and then the number of fans in attendance at some of their sporting events. So you think of, American football or basketball being a large sport. Division I schools may have, 50,000 people attending those games every Saturday, while a Division III school may have 1,000. So some of those things are what determine whether a school is a Division I, II, or III school. But one thing that is interesting is that in the Division I scale, you'll see that 1 out of 25 students on campus is actually a student athlete, while at Division III, 1 in 6. So there's a higher population of NCAA student athletes in Division III than there is in Division I or Division II. And the majority of our schools that are NCAA member schools are actually at the Division III level. So that's just some interesting information there. So this is a list of all of the sports that are sanctioned by us here at the NCAA between men's and women's. So there are 46 women's teams, 46 women's teams, 41 men's teams, and then we do have a few co-ed championships in sports like fencing, rifle, and skiing. Again, this presentation will be available to you afterwards, and you'll see a link right here at the bottom of the screen where you can access this list online. So now we'll start talking about what is the process to become NCAA eligible. So the very first step is to register with the Eligibility Center. So you have to be certified, as I said earlier, academically, meaning you meet the minimum academic requirements, and then you must be certified as an amateur in your sport, meaning you didn't sign a contract or weren't paid as a professional, and a few other things surrounding that. So we have 2 options for registration with us. If you aren't sure if this is a process that you want to pursue or not, you're not actively seeking it, but just want to obtain some information on the process, you can actually create a free profile page on our website. And that's where you can put in all of your information. You can submit transcripts. You can receive emails with reminders and information. And that way, if you choose, a year or 2 from now to not pursue this process, you're not out any money and you are just kind of gaining information on it. Or we have the certification account. So if you are absolutely sure that you want to attend an NCAA school and go through this process and be deemed eligible, you would create a certification account and go through the process of becoming certified. So some of the initial eligibility and academic requirements. So for Division I and II sports, you must meet the following academic requirements. So Division I and II requires you to have an acceptable form of proof of secondary graduation. So that means that you have to be a high school graduate. So for example, students from Ontario, you have to have earned your OSSD, your Ontario Secondary School Diploma. From Quebec, we require at minimum the DES, that Diplôme d'études secondaires. But all of this information can be found in the International Guide, which I'll point you to in our resources, where you can find the lists of acceptable diplomas. You also must complete 16 NCAA approved core courses in the correct subject areas, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And you must earn a minimum core course GPA for Division I of a 2.3, and we'll talk about how to convert your province's grades to that US GPA scale. And then for Division II, the minimum requirement GPA is a 2.2 when averaging those 16 core courses. And then lastly, you must earn an SAT or an ACT score that matches your core course GPA on the Division I and II sliding scales. And I have an example of that on a future slide that we'll go over. So the 16 core courses are required in particular areas. So you'll see that this slide and the next slide look very similar, but just note the differences that this slide is the Division I breakdown of required core courses, where you'll see 4 credits of English or native language. So for example, French for native speakers taken in Quebec would be considered a native language. There's a couple other provinces that have that as well. We'll talk about shortly where to find those approved core course lists, 2 credits of science, 3 credits of math at the Algebra 1 level or higher, 2 credits of social science, 1 additional credit in that English, math, or science area, and then 4 additional core courses. Those can be foreign languages, they can be, additional social sciences. If you took 3 credits, one of them could fall into there. But this is the breakdown as to where those 16 core courses must be in. And if you have more than 16 core courses, we're going to use the best 16 core courses to give you the best possible GPA. So on this next slide, you'll see slightly different here. These are the requirements for Division II, and you'll see that the credit distributions are just slightly different. So just pay attention to that. So for example, only 3 credits of English or native language are required and only 2 credits of math compared to 3 for Division I. However, the additional courses that was only 1 for Division I is now 3 for Division II. So that means you could have more science courses or math courses or English courses. There's more flexibility in where those credits come from. So earlier I mentioned our sliding scale. Here's an example of what the Division I sliding scale looks like. Division II also has a sliding scale with different numbers. So what this means is that if you have the minimum GPA with those 16 core courses of a 2.3 GPA, then that means the SAT score that you must have to qualify, and that's the new SAT, which is March 2016 and after, means you must have scored at least a 980 on that SAT or a 75 on the ACT. And how this sliding scale works is the better GPA you have, the lower test score requirement, or vice versa. So the better test score that you have, the lower GPA requirement. So there's a higher test score requirement for a low GPA, but if you're a strong student at say a 3.5 GPA, then you would only need a 430 on the SAT. Anything that falls below the 2.3 or the 980 on the SAT is what we call an academic red shirt. So that means you're eligible to receive a scholarship and practice with the team, but you would not be eligible to participate in any competition your first year. You would have to earn acceptable credits and GPA in your first year at university to then be eligible your second year to participate. And that's what we call red shirting, meaning that first year you would sit out and then you could potentially have 4 years of eligibility after that if you had full eligibility going into college. So Heather asked if your GPA is high and your SAT score is over 1300, then you are definitely eligible. It means you would meet one of the requirements, which is the sliding scale. So the student would still have to have 16 core courses in an acceptable form of proof of graduation. Someone else also asked if a student athlete can redshirt in multiple years. Typically, there's only 1 redshirt year. If there's an injury later, that would have to be a waiver process through the university. So they'd have to petition for a second redshirt year on a student's behalf. But as the standard practice goes, you only get 1 redshirt year and then 4 years of eligibility after that. Excuse me, I'm fighting some allergies here today. So the next thing that I want to talk about are core courses and Canadian high school codes. So one of the benefits that Canadian students have that no other country outside of the United States has when it comes to NCAA eligibility is that because all of the curriculum in schools is overseen by your ministries of education, that means there's standardized curriculum across each province for the most part. We're able to actually provide an approved core course list for every province within Canada. So this list that you see on the right-hand side here are the school codes that we use, and I'll show you how to use those in just a moment for each territory. There's also a link on the left-hand side here to where you can access that list at a later time if you would like to. But this is how you make sure the classes that you're taking in school will count. So there's several things that we have on that approved core course list. So we're looking at course titles. We're also looking at course codes. So for example, in Ontario, courses with an MUD designation that fall into that English, math, science, social science, or additional core courses typically are approved, but courses with the course code designation of C, O, P, or E are typically at the denied level, the exception to that being the civics course that students typically take in year 10, which I think is like CH2VO or something like that. We'll talk about that more in a moment. But on the approved core course list, once you go there, you will see the course code information for each province at the top of the additional information section on our website. It's also included in our each PDF that we have for each Canadian province, so you can download and print and save, for example, a PDF for Ontario that goes over all of the academic requirements, and that information will be there. So once you know your school code for your province, so for example, Ontario being 998003, you would go to the website and you would click on the list of the high school portal, and then list of NCAA core courses option will be at the top of the page. So you'll click on that, and that will populate this search page right here. So on the left-hand side where it says NCAA high school code, that is where you will type in that 6-digit provincial number that I just provided you in the list on the previous slides. So you would type in here for Ontario 998003 and hit search. And what that will bring up, I know this is kind of small here, but I'm gonna see if I can zoom in on it in a moment and if it'll work. So what those lists tell you are the approved core course codes and the approved core course titles for that province. It also has a list of some denied courses as well. So if you do not see the course and the codes on the approved or the denied list, that means it cannot be used or has not been reviewed. So you should not assume if it's not on the list to use it. You should only use what is on the list and what follows the approved codes, course codes. So approved titles, denied titles, and then also you can find the grading scale. So I'm going to try to zoom in here. Hopefully everyone can see me doing that. Here is an example of the grading scale that's in the Ontario section and where you can view that. If you then slide over here to the core course lists, you'll see, for example, in Ontario, and it breaks it down by section. This is the Canadian GPA, or I'm sorry, the Canadian list for Ontario. And you'll see courses like English 11, ENG 3U is an approved course, English 10, ENG 2D. And then there's more information at the top of the page that gives you the background there on the course codes. So you'll see, it talks about the first 3 characters of the course code indicate the subject of the course. An example, ENG equals English. The 4th character of the course code indicates the grade level. A 1 is for grade 9, a 2 is for grade 10, and etc. So this kind of walks through there, and it says all courses successfully passed in grades 9 through 12 will be awarded credit as it is awarded on the high school transcript, with the exception of civics, CHV2O, which is awarded a half of a unit by the Ministry of Education. So every province has this type of information that further explains how we recognize the course codes and which ones are approved and which ones are denied, or if there's any that are handled on a case-by-case basis. So I do see that Allison asked, is GPA calculated by using only the core courses? Yes, NCAA initial eligibility GPAs are only based on those 16 core courses. So moving on to our next slide here. Just a little bit of facts about Canada and the NCAA. So each summer we calculate information on the previous academic year because we have to allow a full year to pass. So the most recent data available right now is for the 16-17 academic year, where we had over 1,300 Canadian student athletes that were certified for Division 1 and 2 sports, and that includes both men's and women's sports. Roughly 23% of all international students participating in NCAA sports are actually Canadian. And then the NCAA's first international school is actually Simon Fraser University, which is a Division 2 school located in British Columbia. And the top sports that we receive students from every year are ice hockey, followed by soccer, basketball, football, baseball, track, and lacrosse. So Stephanie asked a really good question. So in provinces where high school does not begin until grade 10, like in Alberta, do the grade 9 courses count? Yes, they do. And you'll find information on the grade 9 crediting and information in our international guide in the individual PDF for Alberta. Some other areas do 9 and 10 at like a middle school and 11 and 12 at a high school. I think Manitoba might be one of those, but I might need a refresher on that. So we do still look at that. British Columbia is the same way, where typically we see grade 9 separate from the ministry transcript of 10 through 12. We do still recognize those courses, and the information on those can be found within our international guide. So Division III initial eligibility, I wanted to point out, you'll see in a lot of the presentation here that I just spoke about Division I and II eligibility. For Division III, they determine their own eligibility, both for admissions and for financial aid and practice and competition. So because Division III does not offer athletically based scholarships, they do not go through the initial eligibility process like Division I and II does. Most of their scholarships that they award are academic scholarships, and they are not athletic scholarships. And a lot of Division III student athletes actually play multiple sports. So you may see them participating in 2 sports during their time at the university. And it's not required for Division III student athletes to register with the NCAA Eligibility Center. So the Amateurism Certification process, so all prospective student athletes who are enrolling at a Division I or II institution for the first time, and that does include both US students and international students, and students transferring from a previous college or university to an NCAA school, must be certified as an amateur in their sport. So in order to compete, you have to have a final amateurism certification decision, and that would be posted to your NCAA Eligibility Center account. And then students who are going through the process may practice no more than 45 days without a certification. So if you have not been certified yet and you arrived at campus, there is a 45-day window that you're allowed to continue to practice with the team while that certification is under review. And if it's not finalized within that 45 days, meaning maybe information that we've requested from you was not provided, then you would have to be held out of practice. But students are allowed to request final amateurism April 1st of their final year of high school. So most students have their amateurism certification completed well before they even graduate high school. So this is only an issue if you've not completed the necessary steps prior to arriving on campus. And an amateurism certification does not affect the eligibility for athletically related financial aid. So you can actually receive a scholarship, not be an amateur and not participate on the team, but they could still award you one. You just very rarely see that. Jamie also asked about playing multiple sports or qualified for double sports scholarships. Typically, we see students that receive sports scholarships for multiple sports. We don't see it as often at the Division I and II level because of the time demands, commitments, practice times. It's very difficult at the Division I level to play multiple sports. Sometimes you'll see like track and field and cross country, but we don't typically see a double sports scholarship. It doesn't mean that it can't happen. It's just, it's very minimal. So a few of the resources that are out there and available, the first being the international guide. So that's where you'll see on our landing page here on the right-hand side, you'll see a link to the international guide here, and that's where you can download the link to the international guide. Our registration page is linked here. Information on how to submit academic required documents is right here. So schools can actually email direct from their email address, or they can mail to us through the mail in a school sealed envelope, but this breaks down all of the specifics of how to mail documents. You can also get an amateurism overview, a link to our initial eligibility brochures and quick reference sheets, and then a a link is right here for you as well that will take you directly to this website. And then also using this webinar as well as a good resource to have. So Kelly asked about where we would get this amateurism certification. That is something that we do as the NCAA. So by registering with the NCAA Eligibility Center, answering all of the questions in the registration process about your sports participation, and then clicking the Request Amateurism button when it becomes available in April of the final year of high school, that will then prompt our staff to complete the review to determine if you are an amateur in your sport. But the certification actually appears in your NCAA Eligibility Center account once you're being recruited by an NCAA Division I or II school, and then they have access through a database with us to see that you are in fact certified as an amateur in your sport. Okay. So Heather asked how much the certification count costs. I believe for Canadians it's $80, but we'll provide the link to that information as well afterwards, but I believe $80 is the cost right now. So here's an example when you click on the international guide where you can view the information for each province, and you can download an individual PDF. So I use the examples here of Alberta and British Columbia just because they're the first two in the Canadian section of our guide. And you'll see that this guide breaks down, whoops, bear with me here just a moment while I go back a slide. It provides a sorry, I was trying to zoom in for you, but it doesn't seem to be working. It provides a breakdown of what year 9 is called, what the native languages are that are acceptable, the expected timeline for graduation, what the crediting policies are. So for example, in Alberta, someone asked earlier about grade 9 courses. Language arts and English in grade 9 are worth 1 credit unit. Everything else, all other core courses are worth 0.75 credit units. And then you'll see the crediting policy here for grades 10 through 12 are based on the crediting code that the course is designated with. And you'll find information of the approved diplomas in the acceptable list, and then any denied diplomas or certificates that are issued throughout high school would be listed there as well. So John asked for Quebec, would CEGEP level be considered a college, junior college transfer, or high school level? We actually consider that high school level for NCAA initial eligibility purposes. So earning the DEC extends your graduation date from year 11 to year 13. And if you complete that on time, it would allow you to use all of that coursework towards those 16 core course requirements. Some admissions office may consider some of the CEGEP coursework to be transfer credit in, but for NCAA eligibility purposes, it is considered a high school level. So what the next steps are towards the process and what you should do next. The first step being to register with us here at the NCAA Eligibility Center, review again the academic requirements that I've outlined here, download the PDF of your particular province to find out what information you need to know to be on track to make sure that you have the 16 core courses to become eligible, and then review that approved core course list. So Denise asked, does a student have to graduate from CEGEP? It's not technically a requirement because the DES at the end of year 11 counts as acceptable form of proof of graduation. So if the student had 16 core courses at the end of year 11, they would not have to go on to CEGEP. But in order to count the 2 years of coursework in CEGEP, the student would have to graduate from CEGEP. So looking at NCAA initial eligibility versus university admissions, it's really important to point out that this is a process, the NCAA initial eligibility process is entirely separate from a university's admissions process. So all NCAA schools got together and set minimum requirements for students to participate at Division I and Division II to ensure a fair and equitable playing field for the sports. However, each university's admissions office has complete autonomy as to what they require for the admissions process. So it's very possible for a student to be NCAA eligible, but to not be admitted to a university, and vice versa. A university's admission may allow a student in, but they may not meet the minimum NCAA initial eligibility academic requirements. So it's just important to remember that the process is separate. So if you submit your transcripts and test scores to the NCAA, that does not mean that you're sending them to the admissions offices at every NCAA school. You would have to separately send them to every NCAA school you are interested in. You must apply for admission to every NCAA school that you are interested in attending. And just as a reminder, it's important to connect early with your admissions counselors on those campuses to find out what the early admissions requirements are, what programs are available, etc. So before I hop into recruiting rules, I know we're getting a lot of questions around Quebec. So maybe down the road we can do a Quebec specific presentation. So Anne asked, if you only do 1 year of CEGEP, do those credits won't be looked at unless you finish your DEC. So if you only do 1 year of CEGEP, those credits can count towards Division II eligibility, because Division II does not have a time limitation when you can complete your high school core courses. They'll look at everything completed up until full-time collegiate enrollment, but Division I has what we call a core course time limitation, meaning you have to graduate on time for those courses to be used. If a student graduated on time in 3 years, meaning 9, 10, 11, and then graduation with the DES, they could use 1 credit from that first year of CEGEP towards Division I. Otherwise, they would have to graduate from CEGEP in 2 years to have all of the courses for those 2 years count towards Division I eligibility. Otherwise, it's only going to count towards Division II. So I hope that clarified it for some of our people participating from Quebec today. So for recruiting rules, earlier, some of you may not have been on the presentation yet. Before we started, I answered a few questions. And one of the things that I brought up was our guide to the college-bound student athlete. And I told you that in the presentation today, you would be able to find a link to that. So right here at the bottom is the guide to the college-bound student athlete. If you click on that link, you can download this for free as a PDF. Or if you're a guidance counselor or a parent who would just like to order a hard copy one to have, you can also order those online to be shipped to you. So one thing that's important to know is that each sport, and I know a lot of the questions we received ahead of time were sport-specific questions about when coaches could contact your student. So all of that can be found in the back of our guide on page 32 and 33, as well as 34. So we have recruiting calendars per sports, which I'll show in the presentation here in just a moment. Everything is referred to as freshman year, sophomore year, junior year, senior year, because it's kind of written to the over 100,000 US student athletes that go through this process a year to try to avoid as minimal confusion as possible. So I just wanted to make sure that everyone understood that if you're in grade 9 in Canada, that's considered freshman year, 10th grade sophomore year, 11th grade junior year, with the exception of Quebec. If you are in 11th grade in Quebec, that is considered senior year for recruitment calendar purposes, so keep that in mind. But for all other provinces, it would be junior year, and then senior year would be considered grade 12. So it breaks down year by year for Division I, what those recruiting calendars are, and when coaches can contact you or you can contact coaches. So here's the second link to the guide to the college-bound student athlete for the full recruiting calendar guidelines per sport. So here's an example of what this would look like. So if you look at the sophomore year for Division I, it breaks it down by men's basketball, women's basketball, football, and then all other sports. And you'll see some of the exceptions being men's and women's ice hockey, which is noted on the right. So if you're currently in your sophomore year of high school and looking to go to Division I, or a Division I school is recruiting you, all that they can do during your sophomore year is that, for example, we'll use the sport of men's basketball. You can receive brochures for camps, questionnaires, NCAA materials, non-athletic recruiting publications, and you may begin receiving these recruiting materials June 15th after your sophomore year. So that means that they cannot have contact with you. You'll see for telephone calls, sports other than lacrosse or softball may make calls to the coach at your expense only. So what that means is that you can call the coach, and if the coach answers, they can talk to you, but the coach cannot call you back as a sophomore. So if for whatever reason you have a phone number of a coach, you can call them, but they cannot return your call. So just hope that you get them live. If you leave a voicemail, they will not be calling you back as a sophomore. And a college coach can make unlimited calls beginning June 15th after your sophomore year. So this just talks about per sport what coaches are and are not allowed to do to contact you. You'll see that they can't have any off-campus contact with you. You can't have an official visit during your sophomore year. You can make unlimited unofficial visits, meaning you pay for everything on your own and just go and visit the school. So promoting yourself. Many students, international students especially, use recruiting services. Not so many Canadians compared to the rest of the world. But just know that it's not a requirement. There are some great ones out there, but this is something that you can do on your own. Most US college athletes have promoted themselves to coaches in order to be recruited. So there are very few elite athletes in some of our high profile sports like basketball and football that will be contacted directly by coaches. But what we always recommend that you do is send emails or letters or videos to the coaches directly. If you go to, say you want to attend, I'm just going to make up the name of a school, NCAA University, a particular Division I school, and you want to find out how to get in touch with that coach. If you go to that university's website and go to their athletic department's webpage, oftentimes you will find links to recruitment questionnaires where you can fill out information and submit to the university to show that you have interest in participating there. And you also would want to you can look at their staff directory, find a coach's email address, and you could email the coach directly, a letter of interest, any links to any highlight videos or playing videos that you have online. You could send that to the coach. As a reminder, they may not be able to respond to you, but they could receive that information. Excuse me. Russ said to confirm the definition of sophomore year is grade 10. Yes, that is correct. So, and yes, Allison, you can reach out to coaches directly at any time. It's just that coaches cannot respond until June 15th after your sophomore year. But you are welcome to reach out. The student, parents, anyone can reach out to coaches. They just cannot respond until the outlined prescribed time periods. So things to look at when deciding what NCAA school you want to attend. Be sure to do your research. So in addition to looking at, is it a Division I or II or III school, consider the academics. So does that school offer a program that you're interested in majoring in? Some admissions offices require the TOEFL. We do not require it for NCAA initial eligibility purposes, but some international admissions offices may require that. So find out if that's something that you need to take and what the minimum required TOEFL score is at that admissions office if they require it. Another important thing is to figure out if you fit in academically. Also consider the athletics, find out what the time commitments are, what are the coaching styles of the coaches and assistant coaches, what are the travel that's going to occur. You may be doing further travel at a Division I school and more frequent travel and flying versus at a Division II or III school where other schools and the conferences may be located much closer. So those are all things to take into consideration, time that you may be away from the classroom, having to work with tutors or doing independent study or working on studying while on a bus or a train or a plane to get to your next competition. So just keep all of those things in mind. And then just always remember the intangibles. Do you prefer a large or a small school? So there are schools that have, 40 or 50,000 student athletes on campus. And there are some that have a big city or a small town feel on them. So just make sure that you're considering all of those things when selecting which school that you want to attend. And to find out the coaching styles of a coach, oftentimes if you make an official visit, you'll have the opportunity to interact with some current student athletes. So those are questions that you can ask the current student athletes as to what they feel. But if you're being recruited by a coach or having regular contact, those are also questions that you can ask the coach as well. Expectations of you, playing time, how much time are you going to get to play? But I would definitely utilize any current student athletes that you may have interaction with or reach out to ask some of those specific information. And then just lastly, a few things to look at here are questions that you want to be sure to ask in the recruiting process is, what are the academic resources? So a lot of teams offer tutors and mandatory study tables and further assistance to ensure your academic success. So ask what they have available for your team and for you. Ask what the scholarship renewal process is. Are they guaranteeing you a 4-year scholarship regardless of injury or playing time, or are they offering you a scholarship for 1 year and then going to consider for down the road? Also, you know, if there's coaching turnover, those type of things. Find out what financial aid is available and what the cost of attendance is at that school. A lot of schools will offer lots of different scholarships, and we'll talk about that here in just a moment. So you may be receiving, for example, a 70% athletic scholarship, and maybe they're fulfilling the remainder of your scholarship with an academic scholarship. So if you're a strong student, coaches and athletic departments will get very creative with how they cover your full cost of attendance if they're offering full scholarship. So it's a way to help the scholarships go further amongst the teams. So say a coach only has 4 full scholarships to offer this academic year to a men's ice hockey team. Well, say he's recruiting 2 students that have very high GPAs and test scores that may also qualify for a lot of academic scholarships. That's actually a way to only have to use half of a full scholarship from the athletic department and the other half from the academic department. So he may be able to offer, you know, scholarships to 8 students that year with 4 full scholarships. So those are just things to consider, and you should ask lots of questions about that. Okay, if I'm only receiving a 50% athletic scholarship and a 50% academic scholarship, be sure you know what the requirements are to maintain that academic scholarship, because it may be higher than the athletic scholarship. So if the athletic scholarship has, for example, maybe a 2.7 after your freshman year and 15 credit hours to renew your scholarship, maybe the academic portion of it requires a 3.2 GPA. So you just want to be sure that you're going to ask those questions to make sure that you have that information. Kelly asked, Ivy League schools with Division I sports, they do not give sports scholarships. That is correct. That is just a preference of the Ivy Leagues. That's nothing mandated by the NCAA, but they do not award sports scholarships. I know they have lots of other inventive ways to help in the scholarship process, whether it be through academics, private donors, etc., but they do not offer sports scholarships. Someone asked if women's rugby recruits looking for NIRA Division I and II schools follow the regular NCAA process. I am not familiar what NIRA is, so Jody, if you want to chime in with that, I'd be happy to try to answer your question. So what to send to the schools when you are self-promoting to the coaches? I always recommend emailing or sending a cover letter to the coach expressing your interest in that school and their team. Also provide them with a bit of academic background on you. If you've taken the TOEFL, for those of you that don't know, that's English as a foreign language test, your SAT or ACT scores, and then a copy of your transcript so they can see if you are a student they are wanting to recruit. Excuse me. And then any sports resume with any statistics or results about your participation. For sports like swimming, track, and golf, you know, your lap time or your overall time in, you know, the 100 meter backstroke, that is going to be kind of standard across the sport for individual sports. So they can often look at some of those times or scores to determine if you have a time that's within the range of participants at their university and if they would want to pursue recruiting you. If you have participated in any tournaments for sports like golf or tennis, show your strength on the field. So list who you beat, especially if there's some big time name students that maybe US coaches are more familiar with and you've played them in the past. And if you've beat them or they've beat you, kind of note that so they know where you fall in the rankings. And then again, any videos or posted to YouTube for team sports like soccer, we recommend that you send those. And what I would recommend doing is not just sending a highlight reel. Coaches like to see several minutes of play to see how you are in the game and not just a few action shots or highlights. So be sure to send, you can send the highlight, but also I would send a link to, you know, maybe 15 or 20 minutes of you playing in a game so the coach can get a feel for that as well. So Jody said the National Intercollegiate Rugby Association, they're an emerging NCAA sport. So right, as of right now, they are not an NCAA sponsored sport. It is an emerging sport that they're looking to bring on, but at this time it has not yet been added. So at this time they do not have to go through the process for NCAA initial eligibility. But if that changes here in the coming years, which is very likely, you'll be given notification that students would have to go through the process for the Eligibility Center to seek eligibility. So what I talked about earlier were the different types of scholarships, whether it be a full scholarship, a partial scholarship. Make sure you're having those questions with the coaches and asking, like, are they offering you a full scholarship? Is it a partial scholarship? What's being covered? Is it just tuition? Is it tuition and room and board and meal plan, housing, etc.? So that's the athletic scholarship portion. You could also, if the coach tells you you're a recruited walk-on, what that means is that they are verbally telling you that a spot is promised for you on the team, but they will not be offering you a scholarship. So you would have to pay your own way to attend that university. You're also taking the coach's word for it. So that's them telling you, yes, we'd like you to come participate on the team. We don't have a scholarship, but there's nothing in writing holding them to that. So if you were to show up for tryouts and they've changed their mind, there's nothing that can be done about that because it's just a kind of a verbal discussion with the coach. And then an unrecruited walk-on or tryout means that you're attending a university and you would like to try out for the team. You've not really had any interaction at all prior to you arriving on campus. So there's not a list of schools that have a breakdown. I lost the question here. I think, bear with me here just a second. Okay, there's not a list of schools that break down that are better for certain sports, but you can always look up like Division I women's tennis top 25 ranking, and that can show you like where they rank according to that season. You can also look at past national championship winners, but we don't actually rank them as better for any certain sports on any of our resources anywhere. So I think that really concludes a majority of the information in the presentation today. Suji, I don't know if you want to join back in with us here. I can kind of read through some of the questions that have been put forth down at the bottom. So Jackie says, rugby was not listed as an NCAA sanctioned sport. Do you know if this is a sport that may be added in the future? Yes, so that is what Jody was referring to earlier. The National Intercollegiate Rugby Association is who oversees them now. It's an NCAA emerging sport, meaning that it's something that may become an NCAA sport with scholarships through the athletic departments in the near future, but I don't know any timeline for that. I would definitely recommend looking through that NIRA to find any further information on the schools that offer women's rugby, the scholarship opportunities, etc. So if NCAA should add them through the process for a grade 10 student, I don't think it's necessary to register at this time. You're welcome to create a free profile account. So that way, and follow the eligibility process. That way, if it does become offered, you can then transition to a paid account. But at this time, it would not be required, but you're welcome to be proactive and follow the free profile avenue to make sure that your daughter is on track for eligibility. Someone said, when is too early or too late to start the certification process? It's never too early, we say. You know, 9th grade or year 9 is when the coursework and the eligibility process really starts. So there isn't anything that you can do in year 7 or year 8 other than just making yourself aware that starting in year 9, the courses and the grades are going to count towards the eligibility process. So I think it's never too early to start the process. Too late, I mean, it just depends if you're academically on track. We have had students that, you know, sign up a month or 2 before going to campus. And then, you know, if they've already studied their 4 years of high school and graduated, it may be too late to rectify any deficiencies that they have academically. Also, if they've already signed with an agent or, you know, been a professional in the sport, then that's where it's a little too late, because that does go against our amateur requirements. Someone asked if there's a list or timeline of universities bringing back men's sports that were dropped through Title IX. I'm not sure of that answer. That's something that we can follow up with, Scott. I don't have that information at this time, but our inclusion department may have that information. So we'll be sure to get that information to Suji to share with you after the presentation. Allison asked, if Ivy League schools do not give athletic scholarships, do you have to follow the same rules in contacting the coaching staff? So yes. So recruiting rules are for all NCAA schools, regardless of scholarship or non-scholarship. So even if you're a walk-on or a preferred walk-on and they're recruiting you, they still have to follow those rules. And even if you do not receive a scholarship, all of the eligibility requirements that we talked about today, both academically and amateur, are requirements to participate. That means to step onto the court, step onto the playing field, to represent the university as a student athlete. You have to meet those requirements. So the school will then offer you a sports scholarship by being eligible. So that also is where you can receive a scholarship but not meet the academic requirements, which means you can receive aid or scholarship money to attend that university, but you can't actually play that first year. So it is a requirement. Even if a sports scholarship is not offered, it's required if you want to participate on an NCAA university's sports team. Suji, I know we're at 12:30. Is it okay to answer a few more questions?
I'm okay. I have time. If you have time, you're welcome to answer.
Yeah.
I have some questions that were asked prior. Not sure if you want to. Actually, what we can do is you can go with the questions that are coming up now.
Okay.
Because folks are here already. We'll answer the ones we had been asked before after the webinar. And then
perfect. So it looks like Anne says she still has some questions about the Quebec system. It is spelled out in the Quebec resources, so that's where you'll see the timelines. So you said its academic requirements are unlikely to be completed by our grade 11 athletes, and they're still young. So yes, I agree. That's why I said it's possible, but it's not as common for students to meet the academic requirements after grade 11. We also have information in our international guide and in the guide to the college bound student athlete about the requirements for early academic qualifier. And what that means is after 6 semesters of high school, so 9, 10, and 11, if you have a very high GPA, meaning like a 3.5 or a 3.2, and you have 13 of the 16 core courses, and there's some more information about where those have to be, like 3 of which being English, 2 of which being math, etc. And you have a high SAT score or ACT. I think it used to be like a 980 or an 85 on the ACT. You can actually qualify for what's called early academic qualifier, which means you would be academically eligible based on having high academic progress through the end of your junior year or the end of year 11. So we do see a lot of strong academic Quebec students that meet those requirements after grade 11. But if they do not, they would need to go on and complete that. So I see where you've said CJEP is equivalent to grade 12. So we don't use equivalencies to the US system. We look at the structure of each province and each country's academic system. So with the DES being after year 11, and then there being a 2 or 3 year school afterwards for CJEP, we do say that you actually have to complete that in its entirety and graduate in order for all of those courses to count. So the benefit to that is you are actually being able to have an extra year of high school that other 12-year systems aren't. And so that kind of relieves the still being young part, but then also having 13 years of coursework to look at versus only 11 or 12 like in the other provinces. So someone asked about information on college combines where Division I or II schools participate. We do not affiliate ourselves directly with some of those combines, so we would not be able to post information on those. So, and it's really up to the coaches as to what schools they want to come to. I'm not sure if you're referring to combines for professional sports that the colleges may host, or if you're talking about like high school level combines that are showcasing students for college recruitment. I know there's a lot of different ones out there like Rivals and different camps and stuff in the summers that have that, but we would not have any published information because we don't technically sponsor those. Anne says, would we be best in Quebec doing 2 years of CJEP, at which point we would end up needing to transfer credits. Academically for initial eligibility, that's always the best benefit for the student athlete, but transfer credits would be determined by the admissions office. Is there any minimum age requirement to participate in university sports? That's a great question. There actually is not a minimum. Some sports have a 21st birthday rule of when you need to start by, like men's ice hockey, skiing, there's a few others, but for most sports, no. So for example, say you played golf growing up or in high school and you stopped playing golf after high school competitively. So you just went out and practiced on your own, you didn't play in any organized events, and you continued to do that for 20 years. Say you were 40 years old and decided, I want to go to an NCAA school and I want to get a golf scholarship. You actually could do that as long as you did not compete in organized competition after high school. We have what's called a grace period of 1 year for most sports, except for Division I tennis, which has a 6-month grace period to where you can continue to compete. So if you stop competing in organized competition, there's no age limit on sports, like I said, other than a few of the sports which have 21st birthday rules like men's ice hockey.
So Elizabeth, on that, so there's actually a question that was asked prior to the webinar. Is there a maximum age to be scouted? And they said they have daughters that don't turn 18 until the end of November. They don't feel ready to go away this year and are returning to high school for another year.
Yeah, so how this process works, I want to talk briefly, since we have a little bit of time, about delayed enrollment and what we call a grace period or a gap year. And it's also covered, the information on this is covered into the Guide to the College-Bound Student Athlete. You can find information on this. So I'm going to use the example of a sport with a 1 year grace period. So we'll look at something like softball. Women's softball. Say you're from Ontario and you complete 4 years of high school and you graduate on time at the end of year 12, but you decide you're not ready to go to college yet or come to a university in the US. You can do what's called a gap year, or a grace period year is what we refer to it, which means you could go to a postgraduate school, you could just travel, and you could continue to compete for that one additional year after high school. Sometimes we see students leave Canada and come to a prep school in the US for that 1 year and continue to compete and then enroll after that gap year at a US university. The sports that need to pay attention to this are sports like Division I men's and women's tennis, because Division I men's and women's tennis has a 6-month grace period, which means you can only continue to compete for 6 months after graduation. So if you graduated in June of this year, you can only take time off and continue to compete until December. And then after December, you could not compete in any organized competition until you enrolled the following fall. And what we mean by organized competition was official score kept, were jerseys or uniforms worn, you know, those type of things. Were there any referees or anything like that? So that's what we define official competition as. So if you're just out in the backyard shooting some hoops, playing basketball, there's no time kept, score kept, uniforms, that is not going to impact your eligibility. But if you decided to play in a summer league 3-on-3 tournament and, you know, score was kept and time was kept and, you know, even potentially a uniform, that would impact your eligibility. So those are just important things to remember in the process.
Great. I actually had a question from a guidance counselor
Any other
here.
questions?
Yeah. How can we, as guidance counselors, get access to new waivers every year?
Suji, I think you're muted.
Oh.
I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Oh,
Nope, I can't.
I'm going to type it in, okay?
There we go. Now I can hear you.
Oh, okay. All right. Question was, how can we as guidance counselors get access to new waivers every year?
So waivers, do you think, I don't know if this person is on the chat or not. So high schools do not have access to any waivers except for fee waivers. We typically see that more on the US side, and that is for students that have a fee waiver, meaning typically we see free or reduced lunch at school. If they're eligible for a fee waiver with the SAT or the ACT, then they are typically eligible for a fee waiver with us. And all that the schools would have to do is go in and submit for that. But as Canadian schools, because you do not have individual high school login, you would just have to submit that information via email to us. But that's the only waiver process that's available to high schools. All waivers for eligibility are filed by Division 1 and 2 schools, NCAA schools, or who would file a waiver on a student's behalf.
Great. I actually have a good question here. I'm not sure if we addressed this during the webinar already, but it's so this is from another guidance counselor here in Toronto. My understanding is that our student athletes have to graduate in 4 years from high school to be eligible to play in first year without being redshirted. Is this true? So I wonder why then, when Canadian students get recruited to play for the US private school teams, they are putting them back a year in school. Would this not mean they have not graduated in 4 years and are therefore ineligible to play in the first year?
So this kind of goes back to what I talked about earlier with that gap year and delayed enrollment. The only piece of our NCAA legislation that in order to take advantage of it, you have to graduate on time in 4 years is if you want to use one additional core course after high school. So if you graduate on time with your class in 4 years and you're doing a prep year in the 5th year, in order to use one credit from that 5th year, you have to have graduated on time in 4 years. And the only other exception to that is if you have what we call an education impacting disability, an EID, which there's paperwork to go through to have that approved on file with us. Then if you graduate on time, you're allowed to use up to 3 credits during that extra year. So there's nothing that actually says that you have to graduate on time. It's just remembering that in order to use that extra course for Division 1, you do have to graduate on time. But then also for Division 1, only courses completed within the on-time graduation will count. So if you're supposed to graduate in 4 years and that's considered on time for your province, but you don't graduate until the end of year 5, that's fine. We're just not going to use any courses from year 5 towards your Division 1 eligibility. That would only count towards Division 2. And that's because of that core course time limitation rule for Division 1 that I talked about earlier.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I think we can perhaps close the webinar. If anyone else has questions, they can certainly keep. Oh, wow. Okay. There's a big one. Allison.
A couple of them came in at once there. So yeah, we can definitely follow up on some of these questions after the presentation. So we'll be sure to get that in.
For those who had entered the webinar after I had spoken, we are, so this webinar is being recorded. along with the slides will be provided. We are thinking of adding or creating a Facebook group where everyone can go in and continue with the discussion and ask questions and comment on the video. The video will be recorded, and I'm kind of debating now how we should do this, but I'll talk to Elizabeth, and we'll figure out how her team can kind of allocate their time and resources to support the questions from this webinar, and also any discussions that are kind of any questions that come up in the Facebook group as well. So the more we ask, the better, and then we'll record all the answers to questions inside this guide for everyone to share moving forward. And it looks like we have a lot of questions from Quebec. So I'm not sure, I mean, I know you hinted on this. I mean, I'm happy to kind of get a Q&A session specifically for Quebec in the future. If we do find that there are a lot of questions coming our way for that. But
yeah, and also know that there on the left-hand side of the screen, we do have a link that will be available to an online contact form where you can actually work directly with a member of our customer service staff that are very educated in the Quebec requirements and process. And if you submit an inquiry, it prompts an email to them, and then they can email back and forth with you and answer any of those questions that you have about requirements for Quebec. So please, if you'd like to get a quick answer, you're welcome to use that contact form now and email in your questions.
Great. And finally, last notes here is that we want to send a feedback form after this to everybody who attended. Obviously, we want to see how we can improve future webinars with NCAA and Elizabeth here, and see how we can better support our athletes here in Canada. So I guess I'll let Elizabeth close. I mean,
yeah, I just want to thank everyone for their time today. I'm very excited that there are so many people eager to learn about the NCAA initial eligibility process. And for all other provinces, please feel free to call in to our customer service center. That phone number there, 1-877-262-1492. And our folks on the phone there can help you walk through this process. So I know one of the questions we had was, do I have to use a recruiting service? No, you're welcome to self-promote yourself and our staff for free, aside from your registration fee for the certification account to become eligible. They're going to take as many calls as you want to make. So feel free to contact our staff and ask those particular questions, ask about specific courses, how to send in transcripts, etc. If there's anything that you find confusing on the resources, just pick up the phone and call. Because Quebec is handled just a little differently with the structure, we do have a separate contact process because we have a specialized team for Quebec. So just be sure to use that contact form and our staff will get in touch with you. But thanks everyone again today, and hope that you will look at our information online, and hope this information was helpful.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to close it now.